Welcome, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to today's news report for day 323 of the war in Ukraine. You are listening to The Account. Before we start, I wanted to thank the Nemico network for mentioning my little news report on their live stream last night. I'm really happy so many of you find it helpful and enjoy it. It gives me extra motivation to continue. Thank you, Nemico. And I'm sorry there was a bit of confusion about how to find the account called The Account. And now let's get started with the news report. Today I want to point out one article featuring an interview with Oleksandr Pohrebyskyi, soldier of the 46th Brigade, and the MAXAR Satellite images that were published yesterday. At the end of the report, I want to add a statement by Sergei Sumlieny about Russian values. Otherwise, we have many minor updates, but nothing to really create an individual segment for. We will go over them quickly in the usual news segment of the situation inside Ukraine, the occupied territories, Russia and Belarus, and the international developments. As usual, though, we will take a look at the flashpoints along the front first. Kremina. The General Staff of Ukraine reported repelled attacks and shelling in the area of Kremina. This is an indication that Ukrainian troops might be closer to the town than expected. Soledar. The situation is unknown and I cannot give a proper comment on it. We have videos shared on social media showing Wagner and Russian units patrolling streets in Soledar and around the sports stadium marked with a cross. On the other hand, we have Ukraine reporting that Russia shelled the settlement and that the enemy infiltrates areas to take pictures for propaganda before being pushed back. To give you a general idea, Wagner again claimed the complete capture of Soledar, while Ukraine claims a counteroffensive regained control of the railway station and salt mine number 4, marked here with crosses. Russia also claimed Krasna Hora is under their control, while Ukraine reported repelled attacks. Pro-Russian accounts have started calling the operation to capture Soledar one of the most successful offensive operations in recent history, with the city being taken by storm literally in a matter of weeks by the fighters of the Wagner Group. And in case you want to know how much you can trust Russian information, the Russian Ministry of Defense announced the destruction of 4 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, which have yet to be handed over to Ukraine. And now for some official statements about Soledar. The Ministry of Defense of Ukraine reported this evening that the fight for Soledar continues. Meanwhile, the 46th Separate Airborne Assault Brigade claimed that Ukrainian forces managed to advance after several days of retreat. Serhiy Cherevati, the spokesman for the Eastern Group of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, stated that fighting is ongoing and more than 100 Russian soldiers were killed by artillery today. Brigadier General Alexei Romov said during a briefing that it is wrong to try and estimate control of Soledar in percentages. He said, "Fighting is going on and it's a fierce fighting. So far, so good." President Zelensky, after a meeting of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief's staff, promised that everything necessary for the defense of Soledar and Bakhmut will be provided. Bakhmut. Battles for the settlement are ongoing. Russian units continue to assault Klishchivka without any success. And now for the article I wanted to point out by the Ukrainska Pravda, titled Defense of Soledar, Potential Encirclement and Risks for Bakhmut. Interview with Oleksandr Pohrebyskyi, soldier of the 46th Brigade. The interview is rather long, but gives a great insight into the situation in Soledar from the point of view of the soldiers. Of course, they cannot reveal everything and might be required to stick to certain predefined answers, but I still found it very interesting. Please give it a read. And now for a look at the MAXAR Satellite images that I mentioned. The first 4 pictures show parts of the town of Soledar on August 1st, 2022 and their corresponding counterpart on January 10th, 2023. The last image is from January 7th, 2023 and shows impact craters in fields and along roads around Bakhmut. And now for the news segment, starting as usual with the situation inside Ukraine. With the help of the Red Cross, Ukraine managed to repatriate the bodies of 54 soldiers who died in Olenivka. DNA analysis for identification is ongoing. Ukreinergo reports that the energy system of Ukraine still suffers from a significant power deficit. According to data from Ukraine's Computer Emergency Response Team, Ukrainian organizations were targeted by over 2,000 cyberattacks in 2022. More than 300 of the attacks were against the security and defense sector, 400 of the attacks targeted organizations in the commercial, energy, financial, telecommunication, and software sectors, and around 500 attacks targeted the governmental organizations. Moving on to the latest out of the occupied territories. According to the General Staff of Ukraine, recruitment drives for 2 new PMCs have begun in Crimea. Former soldiers and law enforcement employees are encouraged to sign up, with priority given to officers. In order to generate interest, high monetary rewards are promised. Meanwhile, the National Resistance Center has reported Russia is conscripting civilians with disabilities in Donetsk Oblast as drivers. Furthermore, Russian news outlet Agentstvo stated soldiers who have recovered from severe lung injuries with fragments of shells in their bodies and those who have suffered from heart attacks or strokes are being sent back to the front without consulting doctors. Russian authorities have begun to forcefully evict residents in Enerhodar to create living space for workers sent from the Russian Federation. According to the National Resistance Center, Russian assault units in Luhansk Oblast have been recorded using Ukrainian military uniforms in order to mislead Ukrainian troops. And now a quick look at the latest out of Russia and Belarus. As reported by Belaruski Hayun, 400 Russian conscripts have been transferred from Belarus to Luhansk Oblast. The conscripts were in Belarus for training before being deployed. The Wagner PMC is using civilian trucks and cargo companies to transport dead mercenaries. Requests for transportation can be found practically daily. Journalists found one order saying, weight 6 tons, volume 82 cubic meters, cargo 200, pickup in Rostov-on-Don, delivery to the administration of the Balashiha district near Moscow. Truck must have refrigeration. Cargo is packed in all metal containers. Natalia Humanyuk, head of the Joint Press Center for the Operational Command South, warned that Russia is most likely preparing for another attack using missiles and Iranian drones. The Kremlin is planning to raise conscription age to 30, create 20 new divisions, and expand the Russian army to 1.5 million troops in order to continue the war in Ukraine. And to wrap up the news segment, the international developments. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is unlikely to approve the delivery of Leopard tanks to Ukraine, especially by third countries like Poland, despite the UK's plans to supply its own tanks. Speaking on the condition of anonymity, 2 German officials said that the Chancellor's position allegedly depends heavily on decisions made by US President Joe Biden. An internal document of the Social Democratic Party of Germany was published in which they state that wars are not solved on the battlefield and therefore it is necessary to focus on finding diplomatic solutions. The party believes that even if there is no more trust in the Russian leadership, the policy of small steps can become the way for diplomacy with the Russian Federation. At the same time, they emphasize their support for Ukraine and the need for all actions that will convince Russia to leave and agree to a fair peace treaty with guarantees for the territorial integrity of Ukraine, its future security, as well as bringing war criminals to justice. According to Ambassador of Ukraine in Ankara, Vasil Botnar, a peace summit which was proposed by Kyiv may take place on February 24th at the UN headquarters in New York. During a press conference following a meeting of the US-Japan Security Consultative Committee in Washington, US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has said that as of Wednesday evening, he had no confirmation of the claims made by the Russians about the alleged capture of the Ukrainian town of Soledar. And now for the daily intelligence updates, starting as usual with the UK Ministry of Defense. Over the last 2 days, heavy fighting has continued both around the town of Soledar, Donetsk Oblast, and on the approaches to Kremina, Luhansk Oblast. Since the start of January 2023, Russia has almost certainly allocated elements of the 76th Guards Air Landing Division of the VDV, Airborne Forces, to reinforce the Kremina frontline after assessing the sector was significantly vulnerable. Until November 2022, Russia committed almost the whole of the deployable VDV as long-term ground-holding troops along the front line in the Kherson area. Now redeployed to the Donbas and southern Ukraine, commanders are likely attempting to employ VDV more in line with their supposed doctrinal role as a relatively elite rapid reaction force. Moving on to the latest assessment by the Institute for the Study of War. The decision to appoint the Chief of the General Staff of the Russian Federation, Valery Gerasimov, as the commander of the war against Ukraine is highly likely serving two purposes. For once, it is an attempt to restore the traditional structures of the Russian Ministry of Defense and the army in light of challenges by military bloggers and the Olenivka faction, often represented by Yevgeny Prigozhin, head of the Wagner PMC, who has repeatedly criticized the conduct of the war. The other purpose is to improve the command and control of the different military branches in an effort to intensify Russian operations in Ukraine in 2023. As the Russian defense industry is not able to replenish ammunition stocks in time, it will become difficult for Russia to carry out any offensive actions in Ukraine in 2023. Difficulties with Russia's replenishment of ammunition are being discussed not only in Ukraine and the United States, but also in Russia itself. The Institute noted that Russian sources are increasingly acknowledging that Russia's ammunition and supply shortages are decisively impeding the ability of Russian forces to advance. A reminder that CNN reported on January 10th about how Russia's daily rate of artillery fire has decreased up to 75% in some areas. Should Russia fail to address its fundamental supply problems, the mobilization campaigns will do little to affect the course of the war. And to wrap up the intelligence report, the evening update by the General Staff of Ukraine. The enemy continues to focus its main efforts on attempts to capture Donetsk Oblast within the administrative borders and continuous attempts to advance in the Bakhmut direction. The heaviest fighting continues in the areas of Soledar, Paraskofivka, Bakhmut, and Klishchivka. In the Avdiivka direction, the enemy is conducting unsuccessful offensive actions and in the Kupiansk and Liman areas does not stop trying to improve the tactical position. In the Novopavlivska, Zaporizhia, and Kherson direction, the enemy is defending. The Russian occupiers continue to rob the local population in the temporarily occupied territory of the Kherson region. In one of the settlements of the Kakhovsky district, the occupation authorities announced a list of movable and immovable property of local private entrepreneurs and subsequent nationalization. To replenish the losses in manpower, the enemy does not stop mobilizing the male population, in particular in the temporarily occupied territory of the Luhansk Oblast. The beginning of another wave of mobilization was marked in the city of Alchevsk on January 9th of this year. And to wrap up the news report, a statement on the values of Russia. Sergei Sumlieny, a German expert on Russia, found harsh words for his former homeland. The Russian worldview is based on violence, which is on the top of values. Not wealth, not health, not fun, but violence itself is their basic value. The idea of victory for the Russians is that we destroyed everyone. Our tanks marched across Europe. Russians also have a cult of sexualized violence, including the "We Can Do It Again" car stickers, where two human figures are depicted in a position that apparently implies violence and rape. Victory for them is when you rape someone. Likewise, in the current war, Ukrainians see victory when their country is saved and there are no more threats. Russians see victory when they enter the city, burn everything, rape, and move on. Destroying something is even better for them than stealing. They demonstrate their power in such a way. And that concludes today's news report. Thank you for taking the time to tune in. If you're interested in any of the articles I mentioned, links can be found in the description as usual. You were listening to The Account. Slava Ukraini.